Your problem, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice dripping with the syrupy poison of someone who had just won a prize she didn't deserve, is that you bring these people into our community. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association, gestured with a dismissive flick of her wrist toward my farm crew, who were lined up against the whitewashed fence of my own property, their heads bowed, not in guilt, but in a humiliation I felt burning in my own gut. Two black SUVs from Immigration and Customs Enforcement were parked on the manicured gravel of my driveway, their presence as alien and offensive as a slash of graffiti on a masterpiece. Agents were questioning my men like Hector, who had worked with my family for 2 decades, who had taught my own son how to properly graft a pear tree. His son, a bright kid with a full scholarship to study agricultural science at the state university, was born in the hospital right down the road. Karen stood there, a plus-size empress in a beige pantsuit, her arms crossed over her chest, a smug little smile playing on her lips as she watched the methodical dismantling of my life's quiet joy. She had done this. She had called them, weaponizing a federal agency like a can of wasp spray because she didn't like the look of the men who grew the organic tomatoes she probably bought at the farmer's market. The financial loss was immediate. The entire day's harvest of strawberries, destined for local restaurants, was now wilting in the sun, a carpet of red jewels turning to mush. The threat was existential. My farm, my sanctuary, had been invaded. These people, I repeated, my voice dangerously calm, a tone I had perfected over 30 years on the bench, a tone that meant the storm was not coming, it was already here. These people, Karen, are American residents, skilled agricultural professionals, and more importantly, they are my family, and you have just committed a very, very serious offense. She actually laughed, a short barking sound. Oh, please, I'm protecting our property values. You and your little hobby farm are a blight. I have the full authority of the HOA behind me. She puffed out her chest, a fleshy billboard of entitlement. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. That was the moment, the precise, crystalline second, where the calm, retired judge who wanted to grow heirloom tomatoes in peace died, and the chief judge of the United States District Court for this very district was resurrected. She had no idea. She saw a quiet older man in a dusty work shirt. She had no idea she was trying to swat a fly with a rolled-up newspaper, only to find she just poked a hornet's nest built by a man who wrote the laws on hornet's nests. She was about to find out. Before I tell you how I dismantled her little empire, brick by bureaucratic brick, do me a favor. If you believe in justice and love, seeing a bully get what's coming to them, hit that subscribe button right now. I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare. Your stories matter because this isn't just about my farm. It's about every person who's been pushed around by someone with a little bit of power and a big ego. Now let's get back to it. The story of how I ended up in Karen's crosshairs began not with malice, but with love. My wife Eleanor had passed away 2 years prior. We'd spent 40 years together, building a life measured in legal briefs, late-night debates over constitutional law, and the quiet joy of our shared garden. After she was gone, the large house in the city felt like a mausoleum, the silence deafening. Her dream had always been to retire to a small farm, to have enough land to feel the sun and soil without the shadow of a neighboring high-rise. So I bought this place, 30 acres of rolling hills, a charming old farmhouse, and a barn that smelled of hay and history, all nestled on the far edge of the Oak Haven Estates. It wasn't technically part of the HOA, a fact my real estate lawyer had confirmed thrice, but it shared a long property line and a single access road with the development. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a place to heal, to honor her memory by making her dream a reality. I named it Eleanor's Grove. I poured my grief and my retirement savings into it, restoring the farmhouse, investing in state-of-the-art irrigation, and planting the orchards she and I had sketched out on napkins over dinner 1,000 times, and I brought my team with me. Hector and his crew were the best. They weren't just laborers, they were artisans of the earth. They were all here legally, on H-2A visas or as permanent residents, a fact I, as a federal judge, was obsessively meticulous about. We were building something beautiful, a sustainable farm that provided good jobs and healthy food. Then Karen came knocking. The first time, it was a welcome basket filled with cheap pastries in a 3-inch thick binder of the Oak Haven HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. "Just so you know how we do things around here," she'd said, her eyes scanning past me to my property, not with admiration, but with calculation. I had thanked her, used the binder to prop up a wobbly table leg, and forgotten about it. That was my first mistake. I underestimated the territorial obsession of a person whose only sense of self-worth came from a title printed on cheap letterhead. The first violation notice was for unapproved agricultural activity visible from a member's property. I was a farm. Of course, my activity was agricultural. I was standing in the wreckage of her latest, most egregious act, the taste of ashes in my mouth, and I knew my quiet retirement was officially over. She had brought the law to my doorstep, and by God, I was going to bring it back to hers. The key to navigating any hostile engagement, whether in a courtroom or a field under siege, is to control the initial chaos. While Karen preened for an imaginary audience, I walked calmly toward the senior ICE agent, a man named Diaz with tired eyes and a crisp uniform. I kept my hands visible, my posture non-threatening. "Agent Diaz," I said, reading his name tag. "Judge Marcus Thorne. I'm the owner of this property and the legal employer of these men." His eyes flickered with a bare hint of recognition. Not of my face, but of the title. It was a start. "Sir, we received a credible tip regarding undocumented workers at this location," he stated, his tone professional but firm. "We're just doing our job." I nodded, a gesture of understanding. "I respect that, Agent. However, the tip you received was not credible. It was malicious. I have the documentation for every single person on this property right here." I pulled a thick, waterproof folio from the cab of my truck. This wasn't an accident. After the first HOA notice, I had started carrying it everywhere. Inside were copies of passports, visas, I-9 forms, and Social Security cards, all meticulously organized, tabbed, and cross-referenced. I handed it to him. "You will find that every one of my employees is legally authorized to work in the United States. Mr. Hector Garcia, the gentleman you have in cuffs, has been a lawful permanent resident since 1998. I saw a flicker of something in Diaz's eyes, annoyance, not at me, but at the situation. He was a professional, and he knew when his time was being wasted. He took the folio and began flipping through it, his subordinate joining him. As they reviewed the documents, I walked over to Hector. "Hector, lo siento mucho," I said softly. "Are you all right?" He just nodded, his pride wounded far more than anything else. "We are fine, juez," he said, using the Spanish term for judge they all used with affectionate respect. "She is a mean woman." That was the understatement of the century. I saw Karen marching toward us, her face a thundercloud. "What is the holdup? Arrest them!" she screeched, pointing a finger. Agent Diaz turned, his patience finally snapping. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously low, "step back. Right now. You are interfering with a federal investigation." Her mouth opened and closed like a beached fish. "But I'm the one who called you. I'm the HOA president." Diaz handed the folio back to me. "Judge Thorne's paperwork is impeccable, ma'am. Every one of his employees is legal. We were brought here on a false report." He turned to his men. "Release him. We're leaving." The sound of the handcuffs clicking open was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The agents packed up with brisk, angry efficiency. They knew they'd been used as a pawn in a petty neighborhood dispute, a gross misuse of federal resources. As Agent Diaz got into his vehicle, he paused. "Judge Thorne," he said, "you might want to look into Title 18, Section 1001 of the U.S. Code, making false statements to a federal officer." He gave me a knowing look. Then his SUV crunched down the gravel drive and was gone. Karen stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. Her ultimate power play had fizzled out in under 20 minutes. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "I will ruin you." I looked at her, the smugness gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of her hatred. "No, Karen," I said, the calm returning to my voice, but this time it was edged with glacial steel. "You have no idea what you've just started, but I do. I turned my back on her and went to my men. The first step was reassurance. I gathered them, apologized profusely, and promised them two things. They would be paid for the full day, including the time wasted, and that this would never, ever happen again. I saw the fear in their eyes begin to recede, replaced by the trust I had worked so hard to earn. Then I sent them home to be with their families, telling them to take the next day off on me. Once they were honoring, the real work began. I walked the property line, the long straight fence that separated my sanctuary from her kingdom of beige stucco and manicured lawns. This was the front line. I took out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting the wilting strawberries, the tire tracks from the federal vehicles, everything. Then I went inside to my office, the one room I had designed to mirror my judicial chambers. The walls were lined with books, not just law books, but history, philosophy, strategy. Sun Tzu sat beside Scalia. I pulled out a fresh legal pad. At the top, I wrote a single name, Karen. Underneath it, I drew a line. This was no longer a neighborhood squabble. This was a case, and I intended to prosecute it with the full weight of my experience. The first call I made was to a young man named Ben Carter, my former law clerk. Ben was a bulldog, a brilliant legal mind with a ravenous appetite for discovery and a deep-seated hatred for bullies. He was now a junior partner at a top firm in the city. "Ben," I said when he answered, "it's Marcus. I need your help. It's time to go to war." Karen, true to her word, did not wait long to escalate. The day after the ICE incident, a certified letter arrived. It was a formal notice from the Oak Haven Estates HOA printed on heavy, cream-colored paper stock, meant to convey a sense of unshakable authority. The letter, signed by Karen as president, informed me of a special emergency assessment being levied against my property. The charge? $5,000. The reason cited was costs incurred due to emergency services response and community safety enforcement on adjacent property. She was trying to bill me for the ICE raid she had initiated. It was so brazen, so audaciously stupid, that I almost had to admire the sheer gall. Almost. The letter was accompanied by a flurry of new violation notices, a veritable blizzard of bureaucratic spite. One was for unauthorized commercial vehicle presence, citing my farm's delivery truck. Another was for olfactory nuisance, a complaint about the smell of the premium organic compost I used. My favorite was a fine for $200 because a patch of dandelions had dared to bloom within 10 feet of the HOA property line, a violation of weed and pest control standards. She was using the HOA rulebook like a machine gun, spraying bullets in every direction, hoping one would find its mark. This, I knew, was paperwork as a weapon, a classic tactic of the petty tyrant. They create a system so convoluted and oppressive that most people give up, pay the fine, and fall in line. They were counting on me to do the same. They had miscalculated. I cleared the large oak table in my dining room, the one Eleanor and I used to host dinner parties, and laid out every document. The new notices, the original HOA binder Karen had given me, the deed to my property, the county zoning maps I had already pulled online. This was my war room. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of deep, focused immersion. I didn't just read the HOA covenants, I devoured them. I cross-referenced them with state laws on property rights in homeowners associations. I created a flowchart of their own enforcement procedures, their appeals process, their rules for levying fines and placing liens. I knew their rulebook better than they did, and I found what I was looking for: loopholes, contradictions, and procedural requirements they themselves had likely never followed. My counterattack was methodical. For the $5,000 emergency assessment, I drafted a formal dispute letter. I cited the specific bylaw that stated assessments could only be levied on member properties. I attached a copy of my deed in the official plat map, which clearly showed my farm, Eleanor's Grove, was not and had never been part of the Oak Haven Estates. I pointed out that not only was the assessment illegal, but attempting to collect it constituted fraud. I sent the letter not just to the HOA board, but to their registered corporate agent and, for good measure, a courtesy copy to the state's Attorney General's office, Consumer Protection Division. For each of the smaller violations, I refused to simply pay. Instead, I exercised my right, as detailed in their own bylaws, to a formal hearing before the Architectural Review Committee for each and every notice. The dandelion fine, I demanded a hearing. The compost smell, hearing. The delivery truck, hearing. I filled out the requisite forms in triplicate, my handwriting the same precise script I used to sign federal court orders. I knew this would do two things. First, it would clog their system to a grinding halt. Karen's little committee, likely composed of her and two other board sycophants, would now be legally required to schedule, attend, and adjudicate a dozen separate hearings. Second, it would create a formal record. Every hearing would have to have minutes. Every decision would have to be justified in writing. It was a mountain of work for them, but for me, it was just another Tuesday. The real breakthrough came when I was reviewing the section on financial transparency. The bylaws guaranteed every homeowner the right to inspect the association's financial records upon written request. I drafted a new letter, this one citing bylaw 14.7. I requested to inspect all financial records for the past 3 fiscal years, all receipts, invoices, bank statements, contracts, and the complete general ledger. It was a massive, burdensome request, and I knew it. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, so I would have a legal record of when they received it. The clock was now ticking. Under their own rules, they had 30 days to comply. I had a feeling Karen would not be pleased. This was the part of the process I always enjoyed in court. Discovery. It's the part where the truth, buried under layers of lies and obfuscation, begins to see the light of day. I didn't know what I would find in those financial records, but I knew one thing about people like Karen. The lust for power is almost always entwined with the lust for money, and I suspected her perfectly manicured kingdom was built on a foundation of very dirty secrets. The first crack in Karen's fortress appeared not in a letter, but in person. An older gentleman named Arthur Vance, who lived in the house directly across the road from me, appeared at my gate a few days after my procedural blitzkrieg. He clutched a bundle of his own mail, his shoulders slumped. I'd seen him before, meticulously tending his rose bushes, always offering a hesitant wave. "Judge Thorne?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I heard what you're doing, the hearings, the records request." News traveled fast in a kingdom of gossips. I invited him in for coffee. As he sat at my kitchen table, his story tumbled out, a litany of petty tyrannies. Karen had forced him to tear down a small, tasteful chair ramp he had built for his wife, who suffered from severe arthritis, because he had used non-approved composite material instead of the prohibitively expensive wood the HOA mandated contractor sold. The fines had been ruinous. He'd had to dip into his retirement savings to pay them, and then pay again to have the ramp rebuilt to her exact, absurd specifications. His wife now rarely left the house, too embarrassed and tired to navigate the new, steeper ramp. "She killed my wife's spirit, Judge," Arthur said, his eyes welling up. "I fought in Korea. I never thought I'd be scared of a woman in a pantsuit, but I am. We all are." His story was a key. It turned my personal fight into something more. I realized Karen's attack on me wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of behavior. I wasn't just a target, I was just the first target who had the resources and the stubbornness to fight back effectively. This was no longer about my farm. It was about Arthur's ramp. It was about justice for an entire community held hostage. I spent the next week transforming from a solitary fighter into a community organizer. With Arthur's reluctant help, I began to identify other victims. There was the young couple, the Millers, who were on the verge of foreclosure after being fined thousands of dollars because their children's playset was painted a shade of blue deemed inconsistent with the community's color palette. There was Dave, a Marine Corps veteran like myself, who lived 3 doors down from Karen. He was in a protracted battle over the flagpole in his front yard. It wasn't that flags were forbidden, it was that his flagpole, a standard issue pole he'd had for 20 years, was 2 inches taller than the maximum allowable height in the bylaws. Karen was fining him $50 a day. The flag was the same one that had been draped over his father's casket. She told me I was being disrespectful to the flag by flying it on a non-compliant pole, Dave told me, his jaw tight with a rage I knew all too well. Can you believe the nerve? I started hosting quiet gatherings at my farmhouse in the evenings. At first, only a few came, drawn by a mixture of desperation and curiosity. They huddled in my living room, speaking in hushed tones as if Karen might have the place bugged. I didn't give them a fiery speech. I didn't have to. I just listened. I let them tell their stories, validating their anger and frustration. Then I calmly laid out the facts. I put the HOA bylaws on a large screen I set up, and I walked them through the sections Karen had used against them. Then I showed them the other sections, the ones about their rights, about due process, about the fiduciary duty the board owed to the homeowners. For most of them, it was the first time they had ever felt empowered. She counts on you being isolated, I explained, pointing to the faces in the room. She picks you off one by one. She makes you think you're the only one, that you're the problem. But look around, you are not alone. I created a simple, confidential online form where residents could document their experiences with Karen and the HOA board, uploading photos of the alleged violations and copies of the fines. The stories poured in. A widow fined for a holiday wreath left on her door 2 days after the January 15th removal deadline. A family ordered to dig up a memorial tree they had planted for a lost child because it wasn't on the pre-approved list of foliage. The pattern was undeniable. It was a reign of terror, fueled by cruelty and caprice, all disguised as civic order. My legal case was expanding. It was no longer just about harassment against me. It was a potential class action lawsuit for a pattern of abuse, selective enforcement, and financial malfeasance. The alliance was building. The fear that had held the community in a chokehold was slowly being replaced by a simmering, righteous anger. And in the center of it all, my 30-day deadline for the financial records was ticking down. Karen had no idea that the war was no longer being fought on one front, but on 20. She thought she was fighting a stubborn old man. She was about to find out she was fighting a unified, organized, and very, very angry army. And I was their general. The 30-day deadline for the financial records came and went. In its place, another certified letter arrived from the HOA's lawyer. It was a masterpiece of legalistic deflection. It didn't refuse my request outright. That would be illegal. Instead, it claimed the request was overly broad, burdensome, and seeks confidential information. It offered a compromise. I could schedule an appointment to view a summary report of the finances in the HOA's office in the presence of their attorney for a period not to exceed 1 hour. No photocopies or photographs would be permitted. It was a classic stonewall, a tactic designed to intimidate and exhaust the average homeowner. But I wasn't the average homeowner. I was the man who had written opinions on what constitutes a burdensome discovery request. This wasn't a stonewall. It was a confession. People with nothing to hide don't act like this. I immediately forwarded the letter to Ben Carter, my former clerk. His response was a single text message. They're hiding something. Let's go get it. The legal trap was ready to be sprung. My response to their lawyer was twofold. First, I had Ben file a motion to compel in state court. This legal action would force the HOA to comply with my original, comprehensive request for all financial documents. The motion argued that their refusal was in bad faith and a violation of state law governing HOAs. We requested that the court order the HOA to produce the documents and also pay for all legal fees I was incurring. This moved the fight into a formal legal arena where Karen's bluster and the HOA lawyer's tricks would be judged by a neutral arbiter, a judge. It took the power out of her hands and put it into the hands of the system I knew so well. The second part of my plan was more subtle, and it used Karen's own rulebook against her. Buried deep in the HOA bylaws was a section, Article 5, Section 3, on special meetings of the membership. It stated that a special meeting could be called by the president, a majority of the board, or by a petition signed by just 10% of the homeowners. 10%. In a community of 200 homes, that was only 20 signatures. Thanks to my evening gatherings in the online forum, I had a list of at least 40 residents who were ready to sign anything to stand up to Karen. I printed the petitions. I drafted the agenda for the special meeting myself. The topic was simple: a review of HOA board conduct, financial transparency, and a proposal for a full, independent, third-party audit of all association finances. I didn't need to see the books to know something was wrong. The audit would be the crowbar that would pry open the whole rotten structure. The petition was the legal mechanism to force the vote. I spent a weekend walking the neighborhood with Dave, the Marine vet with the flagpole, and Arthur, the man with the wheelchair ramp. We didn't have to pressure anyone. The moment we explained what the petition was for, people were practically grabbing the pen from my hand. We got 57 signatures in 2 days. I made photocopies of the signed petitions, then sent the original to the HOA board via certified mail, as per the bylaws, formally demanding they scheduled a special meeting within the next 15 days, also as stipulated. Karen was now trapped. She couldn't ignore the petition. It was a legal requirement of the corporation she ran. She was legally obligated to schedule a meeting where her greatest enemy, me, would be given a platform to speak to the entire community, and where the central topic would be her own potential misconduct. While waiting for the court date on the motion to compel and the scheduling of the special meeting, I got an unexpected call. It was from Ben. "Marcus, you are not going to believe this," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "I was doing a deep dive on the HOA's vendors. The landscaping company, Evergreen Solutions, the paving company that did the road resurfacing last year, they don't exist." I sat down. "What do you mean they don't exist?" "I mean there's no state registration, no business license, no insurance records. The addresses listed on the invoices are P.O. boxes, but the checks were cashed. I pulled the bank records we got from a preliminary subpoena. The checks from the HOA to Evergreen Solutions were deposited into an account for a shell corporation, and the sole signatory on that account, a woman named Karen Miller." "Miller Bly?" I asked, my heart starting to pound. "Not her current last name. It's her maiden name," Ben said. "She's been paying herself. She's not just giving kickbacks to contractors. She is the contractor. She's been laundering money from the HOA fees, your fees, Arthur's fees for years." This was it. This was the smoking gun. It had started with a malicious, discriminatory phone call to ICE. It had escalated to bureaucratic harassment. But this was felony embezzlement. This was wire fraud. This was racketeering. The legal trap I had set was about to snap shut, but it was going to catch a much bigger animal than I had ever imagined. The official notice for the special meeting arrived, posted on the community bulletin board, and sent via email. Karen had tried to bury it, scheduling it for a Wednesday night, hoping for low turnout. She had also worded the notice in the most sterile, unappealing language possible. A mandatory meeting to discuss budgetary items. She underestimated the power of the coconut telegraph. My allies and I had been spreading the word for days. We told everyone, this is the night. This is where we make our stand. When Wednesday night came, the clubhouse was packed. People were standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. I saw Arthur in the front row, his back straighter than I'd ever seen it. Dave was there in his Marine Corps dress blues, a silent, powerful statement. The Millers were there holding hands. It was a sea of faces I now knew, a community of people who had decided they weren't going to be victims anymore. Karen and the 2 other board members, a nervous-looking man and a woman who refused to make eye contact with anyone, sat at a long table at the front. Karen, dressed in a garish floral print jacket, banged a gavel. "This special meeting of the Oak Haven Estates HOA is now in session," she said, her voice tight. "The first and only item on the agenda is a review of budgetary matters. We have a prepared statement." "Point of order, Madam President," I said, standing up from my seat in the second row. My voice was calm, but carried easily through the silent, expectant room. All eyes turned to me. Karen's face flushed. "You are out of order, Mr. Thorne. This is not a town hall. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which this association's bylaws explicitly adopt for all meetings, a point of order can be raised at any time," I countered smoothly. "And according to the petition that called this meeting, the agenda is not budgetary matters. The agenda, and I quote, is a review of HOA board conduct, financial transparency, and a proposal for a full, independent, third-party audit. You are attempting to subvert the legally stated purpose of this meeting. My point of order is that you are not following the proper procedure." A murmur went through the crowd. The nervous board members started sweating. Karen's eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally and finding none. She was losing control. Fine, she snapped. You want to talk? Talk. It was the opening I needed. I walked to the front of the room where my son had set up a projector and a laptop. Thank you, Karen, I said, my tone polite. I don't just want to talk. I want to show our neighbors what has been done with their money. I clicked the remote. The first slide was a simple question. Where does your money go? For the next 30 minutes, I delivered the closing argument of my career. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use inflammatory language. I just presented the facts. I showed them the exorbitant fines he levied against Arthur for his ramp, and then showed them the bylaw that allowed for compassionate exceptions, a bylaw Karen had ignored. I showed them the daily fines against Dave for his flagpole, and then showed them a photo of Karen's own house with a decorative flag that violated the exact same height restriction. The hypocrisy was met with a low growl from the audience. Then I moved to the finances. The board refused my legal request to review our community's financial records, I said, clicking to a slide showing their lawyer's letter. They claimed it was burdensome. I wondered why. So we looked into it. The next slide was a flowchart. On one side was the Oak Haven HOA. On the other was a box labeled Evergreen Solutions. An arrow showed over $200,000 in payments over 3 years for landscaping services. I'm sure you all admire the work Evergreen Solutions does, I said dryly. The problem is Evergreen Solutions doesn't exist. The room erupted. Karen leaped to her feet. This is slander. These are lies. Is it a lie, Karen? I asked, my voice dropping. I clicked to the next slide. It was a copy of the incorporation documents for the shell company that received the funds. And at the bottom, a signature. Is this your signature, Karen? On the account for a company registered under your maiden name? Karen Miller? The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Karen stared at the screen, her face ashen. She looked like she had been physically struck. I had exposed her in front of the very people she had lorded her power over. I had stripped her bare. The final slide was the petition's proposal, a motion to immediately suspend the current board, pending a full forensic audit by an independent accounting firm, and to install a temporary oversight committee. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors. All in favor? I asked. A forest of hands shot into the air. It was nearly unanimous. Even the nervous board member, seeing his own skin on the line, slowly raised his hand. Karen stared at the sea of hands, the hands of the people she had bullied and fined and terrorized. And in that moment, she knew she had lost. The meeting descended into chaos, but it was the chaos of revolution. Karen grabbed her purse and fled the room, pushing through the crowd. Its people shouted "thief" and "resign" at her. The war wasn't over, but the decisive battle had been won. She had built her kingdom on fear, and we had just burned it to the ground with the truth. The fallout from the special meeting was swift and devastating for Karen. The temporary oversight committee, led by Dave and Arthur, immediately took control of the HOA's bank accounts, freezing Karen out. They hired the forensic accounting firm I recommended, and within a week, the preliminary report confirmed our worst fears. It wasn't just the fake landscaping company. It was a systematic siphoning of funds through dozens of schemes, kickbacks from the paving contractor, inflated invoices for pool maintenance, consulting fees paid to another shell corporation. The total embezzlement was estimated to be over $500,000 over 5 years. My lawsuit to compel the release of documents became moot. The new committee handed everything over to Ben Carter willingly. But my personal lawsuit against Karen and the HOA for harassment and discrimination was just getting started. Armed with the affidavits from the other residents and the preliminary audit, Ben filed an amended complaint that was a legal nuclear bomb. It laid out a pattern of racketeering activity that would make a mob boss blush. Simultaneously, I made another phone call. This time, it wasn't to my lawyer. It was to the United States Attorney for our district, a man I had appointed to his position years ago. I recused myself from any official involvement, of course, but I laid out the facts as a private citizen, pointing him toward the evidence of mail fraud, wire fraud, and, most deliciously, the false report to a federal agency, the ICE raid. I explained how federal resources were weaponized in a criminal conspiracy to intimidate and harass. He listened patiently and thanked me. He said his office would look into it. 2 weeks later, as I was pruning my apple trees, I saw a new set of official-looking vehicles pull into the Oak Haven estates. They weren't the black SUVs of ICE. These were the dark blue sedans of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They didn't drive to my farm. They drove straight to Karen's house. I watched through my binoculars as 3 agents in sharp suits knocked on her door. It was a far cry from the smug triumph she had displayed during the raid on my farm. This time, she was the one facing the unblinking, professional authority of the federal government. They weren't there to question her. They were there with a search warrant. For the next several hours, they carried out box after box of documents, computers, and hard drives. The local news, tipped off by an anonymous source, I suspect a very satisfied Ben Carter, was there to capture it all. There she was, the powerful HOA president, standing on her immaculate lawn in a bathrobe, her face a mask of horror as her life was publicly dismantled. The community watched, not with glee, but with a quiet, somber sense of vindication. The bully was finally facing a bigger bully, the United States justice system. The charges came down a month later, a 20-count federal indictment, racketeering, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and the one I found most satisfying, 1 count of making false statements to a federal officer. The state's attorney general followed up with their own charges for embezzlement and fraud. Her 2 cronies on the board, in a desperate attempt to save themselves, had flipped on her, agreeing to testify against her in exchange for leniency. Karen's world had completely collapsed. The HOA's insurance company, citing the criminality of her acts, refused to cover her legal defense. The court seized her assets, including the money in the Karen Miller account. The empire she had built on intimidation and theft was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard reality of a long and expensive legal battle she had no chance of winning. I saw her lawyer on the news, a slick man in a pinstripe suit, complaining that his client was the victim of a vindictive personal crusade by a powerful man. He was half right. It was a crusade. But it wasn't personal. It was for Arthur's wife. It was for the Miller's kids. It was for Hector and his crew. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel small by someone drunk on a tiny sip of power. Justice, I have found, is rarely a lightning strike. It is a slow, grinding, methodical process. And Karen was now caught in its gears. With Karen's reign of terror definitively over, the process of healing and rebuilding the community began. The new HOA board, with Dave at the helm, was a breath of fresh air. Their first official act was to pass a resolution formally apologizing to me and my employees for the ICE raid and expunging all of Karen's malicious fines and violations from the records of every resident. Their second act was to hire a lawyer to sue Karen to recover the stolen funds. The change was palpable. The cloud of fear that had hung over Oak Haven Estates for years had lifted. People started talking to each other again. There was a community barbecue where the Millers, their foreclosure threat gone and the fines forgiven, brought a massive bowl of potato salad. Their place set was still the wrong shade of blue, and it had never looked more beautiful. Arthur, with the help of a half-dozen neighbors, tore down the second, hated wheelchair ramp and built a new one, this time to the exact specifications his wife needed. It was made of the non-approved composite material, and it was perfect. I saw her a week later, sitting on her front porch in the sun, a sight Arthur had told me he hadn't seen in years. That more than any legal victory felt like true justice. My farm, Eleanor's Grove, became an unofficial community hub. I hosted a harvest day and invited the entire neighborhood. My men, Hector and the crew, were the guests of honor. They proudly showed the residents how to pick the perfect tomato, how to tell when a melon was ripe. The same people who Karen had tried to paint as a threat were now being celebrated as valued experts and neighbors. Hector's son, the university student, gave a short, brilliant presentation on sustainable agriculture. We sold produce, with all the proceeds going into a new community restoration fund established by the HOA to help families who had suffered financial hardship under Karen. The flagpole in front of Dave's house became a symbol. He didn't take it down or shorten it. Instead, the new board voted to amend the bylaws, striking the ridiculous height restriction. The new rule simply read, residents are encouraged to fly the American flag with pride and respect. It was a small change, but it spoke volumes when it was a shift from a culture of control to a culture of trust. My own legal battle concluded quietly. The new HOA board, as part of their corrective actions, agreed to a settlement in my harassment lawsuit. They paid my legal fees, made a sizable donation to a charity that provides legal aid to migrant farm workers, and we issued a joint statement about the importance of community and mutual respect. I didn't need their money, I needed their public commitment to change. The criminal case against Karen moved through the federal court system. With the mountain of evidence and the testimony of her former allies, her conviction was all but certain. Her trial was set for a date 6 months away, in a courthouse I knew well, before a judge I had mentored. She had once threatened to ruin me with lawyers. Now she was bankrupt, her own lawyers demanding payment she didn't have. She had become a prisoner of the very system she had tried to weaponize. Her power, which had seemed so absolute, was revealed to be a fragile illusion, built on the willingness of good people to remain silent. But people were silent no longer. The air in Oak Haven Estates was cleaner, the colors brighter. It was the same collection of houses on the same manicured streets, but it was a different place. It was a neighborhood transforming back into a community. My sanctuary, which had been violated, now felt more secure than ever, protected not by a fence, but by the bonds of friendship and shared experience with the people on the other side of it. Eleanor would have loved it. Months passed, the seasons turned, the farm thrived. We had a bumper crop of apples, and the pumpkins were growing fat on the vine. The legal drama had faded into the background of daily life, a story the old-timers would tell new residents. Karen had pleaded guilty to a reduced set of charges to avoid a trial, a common end for a case so overwhelmingly one-sided. She was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security federal prison and ordered to pay over $600,000 in restitution to the HOA. The number was staggering, a testament to the depth of her greed. To pay it, she was forced to sell her house, the castle from which she had ruled her petty kingdom. I was on my tractor, turning over the soil for a winter cover crop, when I saw the moving truck. It was a large, anonymous white truck parked in the driveway of Karen's former home. A small crew was methodically loading boxes and furniture. I stopped my work and watched for a moment, a strange sense of finality washing over me. Later that afternoon, a modest, well-used sedan pulled out of the driveway and headed down the road, away from Oak Haven Estates for the last time. It slowed as it passed the entrance to my farm. I was standing by the fence talking with Hector, inspecting a new trellis for our grapevines. The car stopped. Through the dusty windshield, I could see her. It was Karen. She wasn't wearing a power suit or a floral jacket. She was dressed in a simple drab blouse. Her hair wasn't perfectly coiffed. She looked smaller, diminished, stripped of all her former authority. She was just a woman in a car, leaving behind the wreckage of her life. Our eyes met. There was no anger in her gaze anymore. No fire. There was just a hollow, empty exhaustion. She had been so consumed with protecting property values, and now she had no property left. She had been obsessed with who belonged, and now she was the one being exiled. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't wave. I simply held her gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of forgiveness, nor was it one of triumph. It was a nod of acknowledgement. An acknowledgement of the end of a chapter. A quiet confirmation that justice in its slow, relentless way had been served. She looked away first, then pressed the accelerator. The car moved on, disappearing down the road, leaving nothing behind but a small puff of dust. Hector came and stood beside me. "Is that her?" he asked quietly. "Yes, Hector," I said, "that was her." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the empty road. "The men and I," he said, turning to me, his face serious. "We are grateful. You fought for us." "No, Hector," I replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We fought for each other, and for this." I gestured to the fields, the barn, the neat rows of vegetables, the shared access road where Arthur's wife could now safely get her mail. "This is our community. We all protect it." That evening, we didn't have a big celebration. There was no need. The victory was quiet, woven into the fabric of our new ordinary lives. We had a simple dinner at a long table set up in the barn, My family, Hector's family, Dave, Arthur, the Millers. We ate food grown from our own soil, shared stories, and laughed. The sound of it echoed in the rafters, a sound of peace, a sound of earned contentment. Looking at the faces around the table, I understood something more deeply than I ever had from the bench. Justice isn't an abstract legal principle or a verdict read in a courtroom. It's the wheelchair ramp that allows a woman to feel the sun on her face. It's the flag a son flies for his father. It's the right to work with dignity and without fear. It's the quiet meal shared among friends who have faced a storm together and come out stronger on the other side. My war with Karen was over. My quiet retirement, it seemed, could finally begin. And it was more beautiful than I had ever dreamed.